Okay, today's a sort of connected to last time. Today we're going to talk primarily about Borei Pri Hagafen, and little related things also. Okay, and our main topic is going to be our first one, which is about adding water to wine or grape juice. So the bracha you make on grape juice is Borei Pri Hagafen, that includes all types of things made from grape juice or wine. And what happens if a person decides to add water? Either the manufacturer adds water or the consumer adds water. And the question is, is it still a Borei Pri Hagafen? And if yes, is there a certain amount of water you could add before the bracha gets affected? So the Rama in Siman Reish Daled says that you can add, it's possible to add up to 6 times as much water to wine as you have. So you have a gallon of wine, you could add up to 6 gallons of water. Mishmur says that's really a maximum, but it really depends on what's considered normal in your times. So in times of the Gemara, up to 6 times was considered reasonable amount to add. But nowadays, wines are weaker, you don't put in as much, and therefore you'll have to decide what to do. But the maximum will be 6-1. That's what the Rambam means. It's the maximum, but what the exact amount you could add in may change depending on where you are. Now, the question on this Rambam is that was what I just mentioned was in Siman Reish Daled, but in Siman Reish Beis, he says that if you mix wine and beer together, then you make Borei Pri Hagafen only if there's more wine than there is beer. But if there's more beer than wine, then all of a sudden you make shahakal. Now, so why over here is he telling you have to have so much wine? I mean, you have to have, roiv of it has to be wine. While in Reish Daled, he said you could have even if it's just 1/7. I mean, it was 1 part wine and 6 part water. What's the difference between Reish Beis and Reish Daled? So, the Mishmur says, the nafkamina is that in Reish Daled, the person's adding water, while in Reish Beis, he's adding something else. In this case, it was beer. What's the difference? The difference is wine it's typical, it's within reason, it's normal that people water down wine. So basically, water becomes like an ingredient in making this drink, making a wine that's ready for drinking. It's just another ingredient. And therefore, the bracha is hagafen, as long as it's within range of how much would be considered a normal amount to add in for drinking, then that's fine. You could add that in. And nothing, the wine doesn't get overshadowed, so to speak, by the water, because the wine is an ingredient. It's part of making a wine that you could drink is by adding the water into it, therefore it's included. Now, when you add beer, it happens to be, the Mishmur speaks out, that the beer is enhancing the taste of the wine, but even so, beer is not making not making how you make wine for drinking. There's really 2 different things going on here. There's beer and there's wine. So then we follow what's not always the rule, but a lot of times the rule in Hilchas Brachas is that whichever is more, we have a mixture of 2 things. We have a mix of Borei Pri Hagafen and shahakal. So depending on whichever one is the roy, whichever one has the majority, that's the one who keeps the bracha. So more than 50% wine, hagafen. More than 50% beer is shahakal. It's different than the water, because in the water case, the water is not really a separate thing. The water is just something that's going to help us make a better wine, and therefore the water, unless it's a tremendous amount, the water is going to be ignored, and we're going to make a Borei Pri Hagafen. Now, if we want to understand it a little bit better, there's different ways of understanding this difference between water and beer, and let's use an example to help bring out the difference between these opinions. What happens if you add less than 50% water into a wine in a place where people never add water to wine? Okay, they don't add any water to wine. So one way to look at it is to say, look, the difference between water and beer is that water is used for mizug, for dilution. That's usual, and beer is not. So if I have a place where people don't like the wine at all, well, now that mizug thing goes away. There isn't any special advantage of water. So then, if you'd have more than 50% water in the mixture, then you would say the bracha should be shahakal. But the truth is, it's not just that it's like adding beer. We wouldn't say water becomes like beer in a place where we don't do mizug. And again, in a case where we don't do mizug, there's no more dilution, so maybe on one hand we could say water is like beer. But the truth is, you go even further and say the water is worse than the case of beer. In beer, up to 50% beer, the bracha says hagafen. But maybe water is worse than the beer. Why is that? Because in these places, adding water ruins the wine. People don't add water to wine. So beer and wine can potentially be a mix. I guess some people consider that to be reasonable. But water would be ruining it, and it would be worse. It would be potentially be worse than the wine, meaning not just that it's the same, but it's worse than the beer. And it's not the same as adding beer into it. Again, we're in a place where they don't add any water. So the El Yerabba brings from the Olas Tamid, who says, I'm not sure if this is correct, but he brings such a tzad that maybe in places where they don't add water into wine, maybe in those places water is worse than beer. And beer, it stays hagafen up till 50%. But in these places, maybe any water that you add into this makes it become shahakal and not Borei Pri Hagafen. Okay, that's one way of looking at this. What would be what the pshat is in the water. The water is only there because of the mizug part of it, only because it's connected to mizug. If you're in a place that has no mizug, has no dilution, that's not how you make your wine, then water is not only like beer, it's even worse than beer. Now, but the truth is, that's what the Olas Tamid says. The El Yerabba brings it. But the truth is that the Mishabur that I told you beforehand, who explained the difference between Reish Beis and Reish Daled, is his source is some Pri Megadim. And the Pri Megadim says, he makes it a point of saying that even nowadays, that people do not dilute their wine. That's not what they do anymore, even in his days. Even so, a mix of wine and water continues to be Borei Pri Hagafen as long as it's less than 50% water. In other words, when it used to be that people added water into wine, then you could add up to 6 times. So depending on what was normal in your place, you could add up to 6 times as much water. It had this special status. And even if the wine was very small percentage, it could still be Borei Pri Hagafen. Nowadays, no, not true. There's no such thing as mizug anymore. So watering doesn't have this special status. But he's saying it's not worse than the beer is. It's not worse than adding something that, so to speak, doesn't belong. Can't be worse than that. So just like if you have wine and beer mixed together, you decide whichever one is the majority, that's the one who gets the bracha. So to over here, when you have wine and water, the water up to 50% is still will keep it as a Borei Pri Hagafen. Now, so those are different ways of looking at what you do in a place where they don't add water at all. It's not typical to add water at all. Now, if you dig in even a little deeper into the Olas Tamid, I'm going to ask a question on it. It's not exactly what it says in Mincha Shlama, in Yerushalayim Zalman, but he asks a very similar question in a little bit of a different context. Again, it's within these same dinim, but within a little. I'm just going to convert or translate his question a little bit like this. This is a beverage that's called kunditin, and that kunditin is made from only 1/3 wine and 2/3 other ingredients, and the bracha on it is Borei Pri Hagafen. The reason why the bracha is Borei Pri Hagafen is because the wine is the main thing. It's a wine drink, and those other things just complement it and help make it taste better. And Mamela, the bracha on that thing is Borei Pri Hagafen. Now, so that means is the wine doesn't have to be more than 50% of the drink, and it still could be fine. And there's nothing really strange about that. In Hilchas Ikar v'Tafel, at the end of Siman Reish Daled, it says it's possible. So this is the Ikar, even though it's not 50%. I said we often follow whichever is the majority, but it doesn't have to be. It could be even if it's less than 50% also. Okay, so here you have this case of Kuditin, which is not, so there's nothing strange about it. Kuditin, it's only 1/3 wine, but even so, the wine is the Ikar. The other thing is just help make it better somehow. So the bracha says Borei Pri Hagafen. So the question is, why not say that for watered down wine also? Even if people don't dilute the wine, okay. But if you have a mix that's, let's say, 60% wine and 40% water, what's the ikar of this thing? Obviously, the wine is the ikar of this drink. So, the water is obviously not the ikar of the drink. The wine is the ikar of the drink. So why would he say that the bracha shahakol? Why would the Olas Tamid say the bracha shahakol? Okay, there's no more dilution. So, but how can it be worse than like kunditin and these other things like that also? So, what Yerushalayim Zalman says is like this. He says, there's something unusual about the bracha that we make on wine. And that is like this. Usually, the bracha on a fruit juice is shahakol. Fruit juice comes from a fruit, but it does not have the bracha of the ha'et. It doesn't have ha'etz like the fruit has. And that's because the juice is considered a downgrade. This is not the real fruit. This is just like a downgrade from the fruit, and therefore the bracha on it is shahakol. So, okay, that's for most fruit juices. So why is the juice of a grape, meaning wine or grape juice, why is that different? Why doesn't it also say that it should be, Gemara's words are, Zeh ba'alma, it should be like it's nothing. It's like not the real fruit, and it should get a worse bracha. It should get shahakol. So the Gemara answers, Wine has special properties. It's soy to misamech. It makes people become satiated and makes them happy or joyful. And mamela, it's different. So it's an upgrade. Making it into a juice is an upgrade from the grape that it came from. So usually making a juice out of a fruit is a downgrade. It's not the actual fruit itself. But since wine has the special properties of being soy to misamech, therefore the bracha is an improvement. This is an improved form of it, and therefore we make Borei Pri Hagafen. So Shlomo Zalman says, what happens if you take wine and you get rid of the soy to misamech? You get rid of those special properties that wine has to make the bracha. Then it goes back to being just like any old other fruit juice. Okay, sort of like we said before, when you ruin it, it goes back to being like apple juice. Okay, it's just the juice of a fruit, and the juice of a fruit you make a shachal. You don't make a special bracha on it. You don't even make the fruits bracha on it. So it's only can hold on to its hagafen while it's soy to misamech. If you ruin that, then you lose your bracha also. So the Olas Tamid is saying that if you add more water than would be typical in a place where you live, and you're in a place where they add no water, and you're adding basically more than that. You're adding more water than it's supposed to. So what happens is, it's true that the wine is the main component. It's true, it still is. Of course, it's the ikar of the drink. But the wine itself is no longer hagafen. The wine itself is not soy to misamech. The wine portion of it has been ruined. It may not have that property that wine has to have in order to make Pri Hagafen, and therefore, so the wine is the ikar. So what? Wine is the ikar, but this wine is shahakal itself. And mamela, the mix of wine and water, this is the Olas Tamid will hold, is going to be a shahakal. Now, that's that's an explanation for the Olas Tamid. Pri Megadim doesn't go for that. He doesn't agree with that way of looking at it. He says is the diluting it doesn't ruin the wine's status. It doesn't ruin it. So adding the water to the wine is just like adding something else. It might not enhance it. Maybe it doesn't make it better. But like konditin, the other ingredients make this into a better wine. But for us, so the water is not tuffle necessarily to the wine. And we're going to sort of get left hanging what to do like this, which is like this. Should we look at this as a person? Should we look at it as a person who wants wine? He just wants to dilute his wine. In which case, the wine is the ikar and the bracha is hagafen. There's another way of looking at it. Maybe he wants water. He just wants to drink water, but he wants his water to have a little flavor to it, so he's eating the wine as a flavoring. Okay, there's different possibilities of what's going on here. What do we do in cases like this, where it's not automatically obvious what the person wants what they're doing? The answer is we have a basic rule of ikar v'tafel, and the basic rule is whichever is the majority, that's considered to be what the main thing that's in here. Okay, there's no obvious, so to speak, obvious main, so we go with whichever is the rive. So if it's more than, that's what the Pri Megadim says. If it's more than 50% wine, hagafen. More than 50% water, then it's shahakal. Because this is a machlokes, the Olas Tamid and the Pri Megadim. Now, in practice, Rabbi Yashiv and Shlomo Zalman both seem to have made somewhat of a compromise between these two shittas, this Olas Tamid and this Pri Megadim. That's like this. Rabbi Yashiv talks about this in two different places. In one of them, he brings the machlokes, Olas Tamid and the Pri Megadim. Oh, I forgot to mention that when the Pri Megadim himself, after he says his thing that it depends on which is the roiv, he says Ayin Olas Tamid, which to me reads as like, I know that it says that, and he's mesupik about this, but I'm telling you what I think is correct. Anyhow, back to here. So Rabbi Yashiv, in one of his places where he talks about this, brings the machlokes, Olas Tamid and the Pri Megadim, and he says the Pri Megadim, and he goes along with the Pri Megadim, and he says is after the loss is mayim in my roiv hu yain. As long as it's mainly wine, it's considered the bracha is hagafen. Okay, that's what he says in one place. But in another, but that was in Chuvas. In his Pirush on the Gemara, he says that we could follow the roiv. He says that's only if it's wine. But if you're adding water to grape juice, it's not true. Okay, it's only if you what I said over there that, so to speak, the Pri Megadim is right, but not if you add grape juice. Now, I'm not really sure. He gives some explanation. I'm not exactly sure how that explains things, but I'm going to explain what he said, or explain what the potential for his din based on something that Shlomo Zalman says. Well, I told you already that Shlomo Zalman says that adding Borei Pri Hagafen only applies for wine if it's soy to misamech. Okay. If it loses that, I mentioned it beforehand. He says if it's not soy to misamech anymore, then it loses its own hagafen. So Shlomo Zalman says like this. He says really grape juice, meaning the juice that comes out of a grape before it's fermented into wine, is also not Sorim Sameach. He says, well, and since it's not Sorim Sameach, really, in theory, it shouldn't have the bracha of Borei Pri Hagafen. Even grape juice shouldn't have the bracha of Borei Pri Hagafen. Just like I told you, he said, this is his rule. If it's not Sorim Sameach, it doesn't get that special bracha. He said, the only reason why it gets a Borei Pri Hagafen is because it's an early stage of making wine. Since it's at this early stage, it's part of making wine. So, hey, it holds on to the thing that it's on its way, or it's part of, or it's the beginning of the process. I don't know how you want to say it. Something to do with being a certain misamech, but inherently it does not deserve that bracha. So, basically, he says is the grape juices has a very tenuous hold on that bracha. It's got the bracha Borei Pri Hagafen, but only just hanging on by its barely. So, kunditin is a wine which is hagafen. The reason why kunditin gets hagafen is because the main component is wine, and therefore you can do different things to it, but the wine is there and holds Pri Hagafen. But grape juice doesn't work when grape juice is the main component. Grape juice by itself, you make hagafen on it. Grape juice that's diluted, as soon as you dilute it, again in a place where they don't dilute it, like nowadays, it loses the hagafen. In other words, it's so hard to justify it being hagafen in the first place that it could easily lose that bracha, and that means it loses that bracha just by adding some water to it. It loses hagafen. So sort of what's going on here is that they're following the Pri Megadim to say you follow the roiv in cases when it's wine mixed with water, but they follow Olas Tamid when it's grape juice mixed with water. Okay, sort of like a compromise over here, sort of. So what I've told you the past few minutes is the way a lot of Israeli poskim can look at it. Again, Rabbi Yasher, Misham Zalman, and others who follow. But it's my impression that most American poskim follow the Pri Megadim, and even they say that for grape juice. Okay, that's my impression. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Rav Feinstein brings his father as saying you could follow Ramah that you could even up to 6 parts water, which is, that's even a step further. But an example of what I'm just saying to you is that when you buy Kedem light grape juice, it says on the package, with the OU's approval, it says on it that you could use it for kiddush with dalet kosher, even though that drink is really about 1/3 water. Okay, so the way they make it light sugar, I'll tell you more in a second. But one part of that is by adding water to it, and it's 1/3 water, and they still think it's still acceptable to consider that good for Borei Pri Hagafen and kiddush and dalet kosher, because as long as it's more than 50%. Okay, and just to finish the thought before I get back to the light grape juice in a second. So you'd have to know, if you want to add water to wine or to grape juice, you'd have to know how much the manufacturer himself adds to know whether, if you're adding on more, you're ruining it. You're getting over the 50% line. Okay, now just to explain just for a second before I finish up this part, that the OU itself says that the way the company makes, this is not, obviously not private because it's on the OU's website, says that the way they make light grape juice to have less sugar than regular grape juice is one part is by adding, I told you, add about 1/3 water. And the other thing is that they use early harvest grapes. Okay, grapes that are harvested early, so the grapes themselves have less sugar in them. Now, this doesn't say on their website, but it says on the bottle, is that they add sugar substitute to help make it therefore taste sweeter, because it's really not so sweet. But anyhow, so the less sugar is because they use grapes that themselves have less sugar to them, and they add water. So between the two of those, they manage to get the sugar content lower. Now they mentioned themselves, though you mentioned that there's a question. Then wait a second, didn't I tell you? Isn't there a din, which we mentioned last time, that boisar, unripe grapes, are not hagafen? So the bracha on the juice from boisar is shahakal. So if they're using early grapes, seemingly potentially that could mean a shahakal. And to that they answer that they're not considered boisar because, first of all, they seem to be fully developed. And Mishnah Berurah says if they look fully developed, that's good enough, even though they're really not. They are early harvest, but they seem basically fully developed. And there's also there's a lavush that says if you can make wine out of it, then that shows that it's not that's past being boisar. If anything that could be turned into wine is not boisar, and these can, it seems, be turned into wine. Okay, now one last thing about this is when I mentioned this Shuvah Rosh Zaman, the main part of his tshuva was to say that grape juice from concentrate is shahakal. That says the main part of the tshuva is to explain why he thinks that grape juice from concentrate is shahakal, and his reason is because basically you're taking this concentrate, okay, that's the grape juice, and then you add water. Boom! As soon as you add water, he holds that the whole thing becomes shahakal because water and grape juice is shahakal. Now, a different time when we learned about alcoholic beverages. There, I explained to you that the OU doesn't agree with that. Rebelsky didn't agree with that, and he held even grape juice from concentrate is also Borei Pri Hagafen. But the OU wants to accommodate those people who follow Rosh Hashanah. Essentially, they want to follow what Rosh Hashanah said, and therefore they say what they do is they make sure that if they're ever going to add grape juice from concentrate into a different grape juice, like some of the regular grape juices have in them grape juice and concentrate, then if they add grape juice and concentrate, they always make sure that it is less than half of the drink. This way, the beverage is made of mainly regular grape juice, which is hagafen, and less than half is this grape juice that some people wouldn't want to make hagafen on, and therefore they think it's okay. Now, just to quickly tell you, so you might think, well, that didn't solve anything because Rosh Hashanah, you're trying to accommodate Rosh Hashanah's opinion. Rosh Hashanah is the one who holds that if you add things to grape juice, they lose the bracha. So here, look what I did. I added grape juice and concentrate. Even less than 50% should ruin the bracha. I'm not sure if that's correct because remember, the Pri Megadim is talking about adding water to grape juice. The Ramah tells us that adding water to grape juice is different than adding other things to grape juice. Adding beer to grape juice is you for sure follow Roiv. So grape juice and concentrate seemingly is more like beer than it is like water, and seemingly that should mean the bracha should stay hagafen. I'm not sure if that's correct, but at least that's what he tries to do. Again, my point here is that they're going along with this shita that says as long as it's more than 50% wine or grape juice, the bracha is hagafen. And some of the Israeli places can say, no, more than 50% wine is fine, but more than 50% grape juice they were not happy with. Okay. Another thing. Till now I've been talking to you about when you took plain wine or grape juice and you added water or other things to it, what happens but if you change the wine? So I have three examples of that. One is if you turn the wine into wine vinegar. So the simple halacha is that it's not hagafen anymore. And also, if a guy touches it at that point, it does not become usher. It's because it's vinegar, and vinegar doesn't become sam yain. If it was mutter till then, it doesn't become sam yain, and you don't make a hagafen. But when we learned about back then, Simon Kuf Chaf Gimel, I think it was, when we learned about alcoholic beverages, we saw that there's a question to know. It's not always so clear to know when a liquid has passed from the stage of being wine to be considered wine vinegar. Anyhow, you can look back over there about that discussion. Next is brandy, otherwise known as cognac, in certain places, is made by distilling wine until basically you boil out the alcohol, and as a way of concentrating it to make concentrated wine, basically it turns it into a whiskey. So in Har Tzvi, he says different shittas about what the bracha should be is. On the one hand, some say it's so changed from the original wine, so it's not shahakal, and so it's not hagafen anymore. Now it's shahakal. And others say, it's changed, but it's actually improved. So if it's improved, then it should keep bracha of hagafen. So he thinks Rav Tzvi Pesach thinks that the bracha is hagafen. That's what he thinks the din is. Again, he brings different shittas about this. He thinks the bracha is hagafen, and the Kaf HaChaim says no. He says the bracha. He brings some of those same people, and he says no. I think the din is that the bracha is shahakal, and in practice, that's what people do. They make a shahakal on brandy. The next case of change is what happens if you make what's the bracha if you make ices out of grape juice, and that's basically you freeze grape juice. So several places can speak about it. Several contemporary places can speak about it, and basically all of them come out that the bracha is shahakal. Some of them because they think it's for really shahakal. Some of them think it's because it's a safek bracha slahakal. I'll just quickly tell you some of the names involved. There's a Pri Megadim, it's Hakdam Tehillas Brachas, talks about what happens if in this something similar to this. He actually says he's not sure. He thinks he's not sure what the bracha should be. He says, it could be that when it's frozen, it's hagafen. But if you congealed it like by evaporating the water out, then maybe it's shahakal. He's not sure, but that's a possibility he considers. But in the later poskim, in Shevet HaLevi, says that once you freeze it, it became a food, not a drink. So the bracha is not is shahakal. And he says at least it's a safek bracha, so it's shahakal. Diane Weiss says a lot of the same kind of things, but he also brings that he says maybe it's like what the Beis Yosef brings at the beginning of Reish Beis, a din of Arupi. Oh, I think that's pronouncing that right. Which the din is shahakol. That's another thing. And Tzitz Eliezer, he says is for sure it's shahakol because it's not the inshei daitil hachi. It's not sorry to misameach. So it's even worse than mavushal. There's a machlokes rishonim whether what the bracha is on mavushal. He says it's way worse than that. So they say it's shahakol. Okay. Now, one more thing to talk about. This one does not have to do so much with wine per se, and that is something that I mentioned. I mentioned it last time, and I mentioned that some people knew about this, but other people probably don't, just because whatever. So that is currants. That's spelled with a Currants. Okay, and there are two plants that make fruit, and that are called currants. But from in din, they're completely different from each other. Okay, one is this small seedless grape that I spoke about last time. It came from the city of Corinth, which is in Greece, and they were called Corinthian grapes because they came from Corinth. And eventually, that name Corinthian turns into currants, sort of morphed into that. It grows on a vine like every other grape does. It grows in clusters. It looks like every other grape, and it's assumed that it's considered to be wine, in brachas, in kiddush, stam yain, and everything else. Again, last time we spoke about this, whether that some people disagree with that, but by and large, that's assumed that this thing is a grape and has all the dinim of grapes and wine v'chehina. Excuse me. Now that's one kind of currants. The other kind is a berry that grows on a bush. Okay, and they come in black, red, and white. Literally black, red, and white. They don't grow in clusters. They're not sweet. They're sour. And it's a fruit, but it's not a grape. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a minute about these two things. I'm going to call one of them the grape and one of them the berry. They both go by the name currant, but one is a grape and one is a berry. Now, there was a time that the berries were very common in the United States. In 1911, the United States government decided made it illegal to grow them and they got rid of all the existing plants because they thought it was causing a disease affecting pine trees. That was in 1911. In 1966, that's another 55 years later, they undid this ban. Okay, but Lamaisa is they're not very common in the United States because for 55 years, no one had one of these bushes. Okay, so they weren't very common. In contrast to that, in England, which never made a law like this to stop having them, they actually, just the opposite, they encouraged people during World War II to grow these berries because they were high in vitamin C and they were hard for people to get things that had vitamin C in it. So they encouraged people to use them. So there, in England and in lots of other places in Europe, it's very common to use this berry. People make jams and jellies and beverages. They flavor things with it. And people like that taste of that berry. They like it. In America, it's not common. People never saw it for 50 years, so it never became caught on. Now, something else happened while this is all going on, is that in the United States, what we call the grape one, which comes from Greece, the grape one became known as Zante Currants. The Zante is because it has to do with an island that was in Greece that was part of the export business. And the berries, people just call them currants. That's what's in the United States. In the rest of the world, people who speak English, like including England, it's not so obvious how to do it. The berries are often called black currants, either one word or two words, black currants. And the word currant by itself is used for the grape, but could also be used for the berry. So it's a little vague. It's not always so clear in other parts of the world what that word means. So in the United States, if you had someone who had said, I have currant juice, there's nothing particularly sensitive about that. It's coming from the berry, nothing particularly sensitive about that. But in other parts of the world, it potentially is stam yayin, because if it came from the grape, if they're talking about currant juice from the grape, then it would have all the rules of wine, which of course is very strict. They have to make sure on the made hashgacha tamid to avoid stam yayin v'cheina. I've just thrown before I'm about to finish, but just a tidbit, which is Skittles were invented in England in the 1970s, and when they made the purple Skittles, they made it with the taste of currants, of the berries, because people like that taste of the black berry. When they made currants in the United States, the purple one to Americans would never dream that something purple should taste like that. They don't associate that, so they had to make them taste like grape flavor. Because again, to Americans, a purple candy should taste like grapes. So to this day, Skittles in the United States and in England have the purple variety have different flavors to them. Anyhow, Anyhow, back to us. So it's unclear in a lot of the rest of the world what the word currant means, and you'd have to check when you look at a currant juice. Are you getting the berry, or the grape, or the juice of the berry, or the juice of the grape? Now, I'm telling you that you can make. Sometimes the word currant means the grape. That's if you use the word currant by itself. If you say red currant or white currant, then you obviously mean the berry, because the grapes don't come in red and white. The berry comes in black, red, and white, but but if it says something like red currant juice, it's obviously just the fruit juice, and it's not one that has anything to do with the grape and that kind of stuff.